Saskatchewan. Start somewhere inside its borders, pick a direction, and you can drive for hours without ever leaving. A land as vast and varied as its rich history. It doesn't matter where you begin or where you end. It doesn't matter if you're moving or standing still. The place will come to you. It will whisper to you. It will tell you stories. It's a place full of stories. Stories of culture, stories of survival, stories of accomplishment, and stories of people. It will capture your imagination. It will become a part of you. It will move you. Left, right, and center. A political point of view, directions to the character of Saskatchewan, an identity forged from the ghosts of its history. History can be seen as a series of dominoes falling along a timeline. One domino falls onto the next, sometimes several into one. The ghosts of Saskatchewan's past play all around those dominoes. They live there and push those dominoes over and over again. They push them left, and they push them right, and they push them center. And sometimes those dominoes just seem to fall by themselves. In 1905, Saskatchewan became a province, and immigrants began to flood its borders from all over the world. The ghosts of Saskatchewan's past are ghosts which came from foreign lands.
The dream was there, the appeal was there, that you could improve your situation, and in some cases the situation of your children, by moving to the West.
Up until the mid-1800s, the European population of Western Canada was sparse. But in 1870, the Government of Canada acquired a large piece of land from the Hudson Bay Company and wanted it settled quickly. The result was the Dominion Lands Act, passed by Parliament in 1872.
Under the provisions of the Dominion Lands Act, the homesteader could acquire title to 160 acres, a quarter section of unoccupied government land.
Despite the promise of nearly free land, settlement of the West grew slowly. One of the main factors contributing to the settlement boom was the appointment of a new Minister of the Interior in 1896.
Clifford Sifton launched an aggressive campaign to attract settlers from Great Britain, from Europe, and especially from Central and Eastern Europe for the first time, and from the United States. Hundreds of thousands of settlers to take up land in the government's most famous immigration pamphlets of the period, labeled The Last Best West.
Another factor that encouraged people to move west was Canada's strengthening agriculture industry. It wasn't just the government that was concerned about settling the land. Many private companies had an interest in seeing Western Canada grow.
The federal government had given the CPR a land grant of 25 million acres. So the CPR was active in the United States in attempting to sell this land to American settlers. Other private companies followed suit.
One private organization, the Loose Land Company, had its own special brand of real estate marketing.
Among other things was that it owned a fleet of real automobiles, the largest single number of cars owned by one individual or company in the province, apparently, which were used to take settlers out to look at the land and to form an impression of how productive it could be.
While government and private companies did their best to sell the idea of moving west, historians debate on what drove so many people to take a chance on a new and untamed land.
Settlers came to Western Canada because they were told there were millions and millions of acres of soil fit for the plow, ready to be cultivated, that you could make a success of agriculture on the prairies.
By the 1920s, the government's initiative to populate the West proved successful. Close to 1 million people had moved to the province. By 1925, Saskatchewan had the highest per capita income in the world, truly making the province the last best West.
There's been the misconception among Canadian society that all Doukhobors run around naked and burn down schools. And it's tragic because it's resulted in many Doukhobors being ashamed of their own heritage.
The Doukhobors originated in Russia in the late 1700s and eventually spread across the Russian Empire. They were united by their belief in universal brotherhood.
The Doukhobors hold the basic principle that because the Spirit of God resides in each and every person, then any need for external authorities, both church and state, is unnecessary and superfluous.
The Russian Orthodox Church didn't agree and began a campaign of discrimination against the Doukhobors.
They were known by their name in Russia as Doukhobors, which roughly translates as spirit wrestlers. That name was given as an offensive name to them by church and state authorities. However, the sect reinterpreted the name in a positive fashion as meaning those who wrestle with and for the Spirit of God.
The Doukhobors' reputation as hard workers and the religious prosecution they endured brought them to the attention of the Canadian government.
The Minister of the Interior at the time, Clifford Sifta, was looking for people of peasant background that would be able to settle Western Canada and make their farms work. He wanted persistent, hardy people, and he believed that the Doukhobors would fit the bill.
In 1899, with financial assistance from the famous Russian author Tolstoy, 7,500 Doukhobors emigrated from Russia to Canada and settled in the Prince Albert and Yorkton districts.
They established over 60 communal villages in the areas of what is now Langham, Blaine Lake, Saskatoon, Kylemore, Buchanan, Kenora, Berrigan, Kamsack, Pelly, and Erin.
In 1903, Peter Verrigan, the exiled leader of the Doukhobors, arrived in Saskatchewan. Under Verrigan's leadership, the communal settlements thrived.
He revitalized the Doukhobor movement at the end of the 1880s and 90s and revitalized many of the teachings which had fallen into disuse throughout much of the 19th century in Russia. Primarily, he emphasized the spiritual belief in nonviolence, in vegetarianism, and in communal ownership and organization.
In 1905, a land dispute arose with the government. Homestead policy required that the land be worked individually, not communally. The dispute split the community. Peter Verrigan purchased land in BC, and a large contingent of Doukhobors left with him to form the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood. In the early 1900s, Doukhobor settlements were often mistakenly identified with a fringe group, the Sons of Freedom, a radical extremist group who fought government policy and were implicated in many illegal actions.
The tragedy of the Sons of Freedom Doukhobors is that the Canadian press painted all Doukhobors of all denominations with the same brush.
Although the Doukhobor communities were known primarily for their ties to agriculture, they also started many businesses.
The Doukhobors operated, owned, and maintained Doukhobor brickyards. The Doukhobors were also grain buyers and operated a number of elevators. The community Doukhobors operated a network of warehouses and general trading stores.
Doukhobor immigration has had a profound effect on the character and prosperity of Saskatchewan.
The Doukhobors in 1899 were the largest single mass immigration of settlers to Canada, not only to Saskatchewan. And if for that alone, they remain unique in their contribution to Saskatchewan.
Those who came with a common language, a common religion, a common way of being. They brought their old ways to a brand new province. Across Saskatchewan, like-minded communities sprang up, like dominoes setting themselves across the plains.
At the turn of the century, Romanian settlers in Flintoft, Saskatchewan, wanted to build their own place of worship.
Basically, Romania is 90% Orthodox, and they felt that they wanted to have a place of worship of their own. For many of them, it would also provide a social life, because at that particular time, there was very little else to do other than work on the farm, work in the home, and of course, go to church.
Life was hard for the settlers, and there was no money to build a church.
These people lived in dugouts and in sod houses and in tents. They left their mother country so that they could provide a better lifestyle for their families, but they encountered many hardships.
Fortunately for the community, a fellow countryman came to their aid.
In December of 1910, of course, Mr. Nikolai Dwara visited the relatives in the Flintoft area. and offered to pay $6,000 for the purchase of the lumber to build the church.
The interior of the church was decorated with donated, handmade items, such as carved stands, candle holders, and many beautiful icons. A unique and valuable object in the church is its rare iconostas.
An iconostas provides a panoramic view of all of the saints of the church, and of course of Christ and the Virgin Mary and the angels as well. They apparently ordered the iconostas, and we believe it was ordered from Jerusalem. It was painted by a Romanian monk. That particular Romanian monk only painted the one iconostas, the one that's in that church at Flintoff. He apparently died after that. So this makes it a very unique iconostas. The paintings, we understand, are very valuable, not only from the spiritual point of it, but the fact that they are very rare.
Today, St. Peter and Paul Romanian Orthodox Church has about 25 members and is open from spring to fall.
Probably 75 to 90% are either the children or the grandchildren of the old pioneers. Of course, they want to keep the church going as long as possible.
This humble prairie church has been a part of Saskatchewan's rich history for nearly a century.
Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan had a very different way of being. You might say that's where the ghosts first got off the train. When the train left, right down the center of the horizon, one could see the beginnings of something murky. A murky future left from the past.
Bootlegging, prostitution, and unsavory elements usually spell trouble, but for one Saskatchewan community, they meant something completely different, a thriving business. Welcome to the tunnels of Moose Jaw, a tourist attraction that doesn't shy away from the skeletons in its closet.
In the last 5 years, Moose Jaw was the fastest growing city in tourism in all of Canada. We have guests from every province in Canada, every state in the U.S., and I think it's up to over 60 countries now across the world.
The tourist attraction began with the discovery of tunnels that appeared to date from the early 1900s beneath the main streets of Moose Jaw.
Nobody really knows where these tunnels really originated from. We can speculate that the fact that they were most likely used for boilermakers and steam engineers to service all the different boilers.
Artifacts in the tunnels led to speculation that they might have been used in the 1920s by bootleggers.
It was easy access from building to building without being seen. There was some speculation there was access to the train station so that booze could be taken or loaded off.
The notion that the tunnels had been used for bootlegging led credence to local rumors of one of the most famous gangsters of all time.
There's hints of Al Capone sightings throughout this area, but I don't think really anyone in Saskatchewan in the world really knew about it.
Although there is some debate over the validity of the Capone connection, there's at least one logical reason he could have visited Moose Jaw.
The Sioux Line, it's the railroad that connects from Chicago to Moose Jaw, and it's an easy, direct way to transport whatever you'd like, and during that time I think booze was one of them.
With these simple ingredients, mysterious tunnels, bootlegging, and Al Capone, the first attraction opened for business in 1997.
Originally it was a non-profit corporation called the Tunnels of Little Chicago, and basically they'd kind of take you down and show you some of the different areas, but it was very, very loose and not as developed as it is now.
After only a few years of operation, the Tunnels of Little Chicago was reinvented.
That changed in 2000 when the management company of the Tunnels of Moose Jaw took over and really expanded the tunnels, put theatrical elements into it, and made it more of a real theater tour.
The upgraded tour includes rebuilt and decorated tunnels, actors, and 2 storylines about Moose Jaw's underground history.
One is the Chicago connection, the connection to Al Capone and rum running in the 1920s. It has to do with you basically coming in as a bootlegger. You play that role and you interact with different actor guides, get through the high life and the low life of being a bootlegger in the gangster world of Al Capone's organization. The other tour is the Passage to Fortune. More of a Canadian tour. It has to do with Chinese immigration into Canada during the building of the CPR, prejudices that they have faced over the years, and basically their eventual integration into multicultural Canada and their successes.
The Tunnels of Moose Jaw draws tourists from around the corner and across the globe, giving a unique spin on a one-of-a-kind Saskatchewan story.
Prohibition was a popular cause in Canada and in Saskatchewan during the First World War. Saskatchewan was actually the first province to close the liquor stores and bars in 1915.
Prohibition in Saskatchewan meant that alcohol could no longer be sold or consumed. It opened a chapter in the province's history that featured bootlegging, bathtub gin, organized crime, and speakeasies.
By 1917, the three prairie provinces were as dry as the law could make them. From the spring of 1918 to the fall of 1919, you couldn't import liquor into Canada, you couldn't manufacture liquor in Canada, you couldn't move it across provincial boundaries, you couldn't sell it in any province.
The strictest regulations were repealed after hostilities ended in World War I. Although Prohibition was still in force in Saskatchewan, liquor could still be sold by businessmen with a federal license to produce and export alcohol.
In January 1920, the United States adopted a national prohibition law, the Volstead Act. This provided a golden opportunity for some Saskatchewan businessmen to get rich by supplying liquor to American rum runners. The most successful of these businessmen was a man named Harry Bronfman. It was illegal, of course, to import liquor into the United States under American law, but Canada's federal governments in the 1920s didn't believe it was their responsibility to help enforce the Volstead Act.
Alcohol flowed quite freely in Saskatchewan. From local bathtub gin makers and larger distributors, speakeasies across the province had plenty of ways to wet their customers' whistles.
Not all of the liquor in these export warehouses along the American border made its way into the hands of American rum runners. Some was also sold to local bootleggers in Estevan and Weyburn and Regina and Moose Jaw.
The federal government fell under increasing pressure to do something about the illegal alcohol trade that was crossing the border into the United States. A violent murder in an otherwise sleepy Saskatchewan town gave the government the excuse it needed.
In October 1922, Harry Bronfman's brother-in-law, Matt Hoff, was actually murdered in the Beanfate railway station by an American rum runner who thought he'd been cheated by the Bronfmans. In any event, the controversy that arose as a result of Matt Hoff's murder put pressure on the federal government to close the export warehouses altogether, and it did so in December 1922.
The government's decision prompted Harry Bronfman to move on to other business ventures.
They quickly acquired Seagram's distilleries, and the rest, as they say, is history.
The Bronfman empire grew into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that included Hollywood's MCA Universal. In 1924, Prohibition came to an end in Saskatchewan. But stories of distant relatives who made gin in their bathtubs or ran rum for shady characters continue to be told, providing a touch of intrigue to the history of our province.
The ghosts push those dominoes over and over again. They never stop. If you're watching closely, you can see those dominoes coming. And if you're really watching, you can see where they're going. You can get run over, or you can find a safe place to stand. The right thing to say is often left to the one talking the loudest. The right thing to do is never easy to figure out when you're at the center of a domino earthquake.
Mention the Ku Klux Klan and most people think of cross burnings, lynchings, and men dressed in white sheets in America's Deep South. However, a hidden fact of Saskatchewan's history reveals that the KKK was a powerful social force in the 1920s.
The Klan was a secret society. It was white supremacist, anti-black, but then it quickly went on to become anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic.
The success of the Klan is that it was able to appeal to a broad segment of the population so that everybody could say, yes, there's something in the Klan for me.
The Ku Klux Klan had a simple agenda for their expansion into Canada and eventually Saskatchewan.
It seemed to me that it was simply greed. They were there to make an easy dollar, and they did.
Klan membership cost $13 a person, no small amount in those days. In 1928, the Saskatchewan Klan boasted a membership of 70,000, although historians estimate it to be closer to 25,000. The Klan's message was seductive, and many well-meaning Saskatchewan people got caught up in the propaganda.
I think just probably they knew a fraction of what we would know now about the Ku Klux Klan, and we look back and wonder, how on earth could so many people in a town or a village join such an organization? But they weren't up on what we are and the violence and the crime that the Klan has been involved in at that time.
Not only were people ignorant of the Klan's reputation in the States, but the KKK in Saskatchewan was very different than its U.S. counterpart.
The target audience in Saskatchewan would not have gone for violence.
No.
They simply would have abandoned the Klan. They would have seen it for what it was.
But it seemed to me they were just mainly rallies, just almost like camp meetings or something like that. A number of instances where the burning of the cross was reported, but I didn't find an awful lot of reports on the regalia and all of that, although it obviously was around all right.
While the Saskatchewan Klan didn't focus on selling violence or regalia, it did adopt the hot issues of the time. In Saskatchewan, it was politics.
I'm convinced that had there not been the political issue, the Klan would not have succeeded the way it did.
The Klan created the issue of Catholic and immigrant influence as a threat to British values. The issue had no basis in reality, but it proved to be a perfect lightning rod which unified many people across the province. By 1929, Klan membership included prominent Saskatchewan doctors, lawyers, MLAs, and other powerful figures. One of the ways the Klan brought these issues to the forefront was through public lectures.
They had a number of speakers. Some were quite prominent.
They were really colorful characters. As far as I'm concerned, con men able to sell refrigerators to Eskimos, but they were eloquent.
Other groups opposed to the Liberal Party had much to gain from the KKK's outspokenness.
It could make just outrageous accusations and say outrageous things that a political party wouldn't stoop to.
The Ku Klux Klan campaigned against the government of Jimmy Gardiner and the Liberal Party, which had been in power for 24 years.
It's undoubtedly the Conservative Party gained, because the Klan was able to do something that the political parties couldn't do.
The Gardiner administration was defeated in 1929, but the success of the KKK ultimately led to its demise.
Yeah, success kills. Then the Depression. I think that focused the attention of Saskatchewan on more immediate issues, such as, feeding the family today.
Bigotry and prejudice tend to fall by the wayside when one is preoccupied by issues of survival. Support for the Klan began to fall off, almost as fast as it began.
And I think personally it probably is a lesson in just being very cautious about what organizations individually you endorse, and the wisdom of finding out something about them before you make a commitment to them.
The power of being right has in the past left others feeling a bit run over. Domino tracks mark the center of their back, and the ghosts just keep it coming. Wisdom is the key to the deal. You want to see the dominoes coming and going, you need to get wise. But that kind of wisdom only comes to you after being run over a few times. Domino tracks have their own way of being right.
He was small in stature, but he was large in intelligence. He was a good speaker and very fluent, but serious. So far as I knew, he had no sense of humor whatsoever, but very pleasant to meet.
James Garfield Gardiner knew the hardships and joys of farm life long before he went into politics.
They called him the Western Colossus and the Great Prairie Man, this type of thing, because he spoke in the House continuously on helping out the prairie farmer. When he was working on the farming community out there, he obtained his teaching certificate. Once he got his teaching certificate, moved to Regina in 1904, started teaching down in Hirsch, just outside of Estevan.
Gardiner eventually moved to Lemberg, where his formal introduction to provincial politics began.
It wasn't unusual to have 6 speakers come and speak on behalf of the individual who was running. And they would go from community to community throughout the riding and speak on behalf of the candidate. And that's what my grandfather did for the first few years before he himself was elected.
Gardiner was elected as an MLA in 1914. He focused his efforts on health issues.
There's a lot of health issues that were just sort of on the cutting edge at that time. They were opening up certain clinics and hospitals. There was the sanatorium just outside of Fort Capel. The School of the Deaf was built around the same time in his administration. There was also tuberculosis clinics.
In 1922, Gardiner was appointed Highways Minister. In 1926, Gardiner became Premier and led the fight against the Ku Klux Klan of Saskatchewan. Gardiner's government fell to the Klan-backed conservative government of James Anderson in 1929, but Gardiner led his party to power again in 1934. Within a year, Prime Minister Mackenzie King offered Gardiner the position of Minister of Agriculture. Gardiner accepted and resigned as Premier.
All of my grandfather's efforts at that time went to doing what he could to provide a reasonable farm income for families. The PFRA, the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act, was actually brought into force in 1935, and then in 1937 there was the Prairie Farm Assistance Act, which helped out those people in the agricultural community who were suffering from the low prices.
Gardiner was also instrumental in the development of the South Saskatchewan River Project.
His dream of the Gardiner Dam and creating that man-made lake, which would later become Diefenbaker Lake, and using it not only for agricultural purposes but for hydroelectricity, so it would help out Saskatchewan's economy and hopefully provide some industry.
Gardiner was Minister of Agriculture for 22 years until the Liberal government was defeated in 1957. That made Gardiner the longest-serving cabinet member in one portfolio. Until his death in 1962, James Gardiner remained an active member of his community and a man well remembered for his part in shaping Saskatchewan.
The ghosts and the dominoes have their own way of being as well. It was 1929 and a Klan-backed conservative government was about to take the province of Saskatchewan into a new decade. But just as the Klan was tightening its grip on the reins of power, an even greater menace came calling. The entire world would never be the same again.